You're listening to episode 62 of the Confident Writer podcast with Jane Pike. Hello, fabulous human. I hope you're having the best day possible, no matter where it is you find yourself in the world. It is very early in the morning here at the time of recording. It's 5 a.m. And I just had a little bit of a giggle to myself because I haven't actually used my voice this morning. There's no one in my house that is awake. I'm obviously alone in my little office recording this, and I thought maybe I should sing some scales or something to kind of wake my voice up. So it's just me and the coffee and you riffing it out this morning, having a good time, chattering about what it is we're going to talk about. So the main topic that I am going to introduce you to today is the importance of novelty. But before that, we're going to start with something else, because as I walked into my office this morning, I noticed these beautiful flowers that my husband had picked for me yesterday, bless his heart. And they're a combination of daffodils, and I think it's called mimosa, which is like, it's bright yellow and it's got all these little they look like little pom-poms all over it. It's really beautiful. But the daffodil, I think there must be lots of different types of daffodils, but this particular daffodil is really complex. Like, it's got loads of different layers. There are many different colours in it when you look at it closely. And it kind of blew me away with its complexity and intricacy and just beauty, basically. And that something can exist just for the sake of it. That daffodil can pop up, and maybe it popped up somewhere where no human was ever going to notice it. No one was ever going to go, what a beautiful daffodil that is. But this daffodil just happened to pop up in my garden. And I looked at it this morning and was like, wow, look at you. Aren't you gorgeous? And that's wonderment, right? I thought that is wonderment. And I've been riffing a little bit this week, or kind of musing over the idea of wonderment this week. And I think it's such a beautiful word. I looked it up before and it said to hold awe and beauty and admiration about something. I mean, I'm paraphrasing. That's not exactly what it said in the dictionary, because we'd wonder where their use of correct English grammar had gone. But basically it was to hold awe and wonder. And what I wanted to extend that to is this idea of also holding awe and wonder for the everyday miracle that it is, that we are allowed, that our horses allow us to work with them in the way that they do, that they allow us to play with them in the way that they do. If there is any greater wonder in my life, I'm not sure. But that to me is something that we really easily lose sight of in the nitty-gritty, in the pursuit of what it is that we want to create or what it is that we want to happen, in all the goals and so on and so forth. This basic wonderment that here in front of me is this amazing creature who is infinitely more physically powerful than me, who pretty much could decide at any moment, should they wish to not participate in this relationship or this conversation. And yet, this magic occurs, this alchemy occurs, where we ride together, we play together, we learn together. It's incredible. It really is incredible. So I think periodically, more often than we allow ourselves to, we need to come back to that little piece, that huge piece, and recognize just what a blessing that is, that we're able to do what it is that we do with our horses, to bring a little bit of wonderment back to our day. Yes. I was just thinking about the kind of heaviness of the global atmosphere right now, for very good reason, with the variety of different things that are going on and stuff that's swirling around our mental, emotional cosmos. and the necessity then to just really seek out these little pieces of wonderment in your day, these little pieces of magic in your day, so that you can zoom out again and connect back up to this bigger picture. And for me, that little daffodil did that this morning. It brought that little sense of wonderment, big little sense of wonderment back into my day. So I just wanted to share that with you before we got going into the other stuff. So as you may or may not remember, in last week's episode, I talked about a spotlight session that I was having around decoupling. And that decoupling was removing the relationship, the felt relationship that's often developed inside of us between the internal revving up of our system, so that sympathetic energy that comes when we prepare to do something hard, or perhaps when we're feeling a little bit concerned about something, removing that from an immediate negative association. And a lot of what I experience in my work and observe in the writers that I work with is that fusion of any type of activity or activation in the body with a negative label is really prevalent. And it's perhaps one of the most important things that we're working to deconstruct, to really develop a bigger degree or a finer degree of nuance in terms of what it is we're experiencing internally, and have some more intentionality about how it is we are labeling those experiences so that it automatically doesn't take us down the rabbit hole. And a part of that, in the session, what I talked about was the necessity for novelty. So let's pre-frame this a little bit, because ultimately what we are looking to do, I was trying to think of a more articulate word, but ultimately what we're looking to do is develop a degree of responsiveness in our nervous system where we're able to fluidly move into any channel that is appropriate to meet the moment. So what that means is I can actually move away from something. I can move into the flight channel if that's appropriate for the moment. But after the threat, quote unquote, has been removed from my experience, then I'm able to go back into the settling. I'm able to go back into a rested place. I'm able to move into the fight channel if necessary, meaning that I can move towards something. I can mobilize my body. I can mobilize my voice. I can use my own agency to defend myself should I need to. And then once again, I can come back down into this rest and settled place. So that responsiveness is so important. And in order for us to be able to access all of these different ways of responding to the world, we need to make sure that they're familiar to us in some way and they're not taboo, meaning that if we have an experience of fight energy, that is appropriate. So we need to connect to our backbone in that moment to maybe alchemize some fear that we're experiencing that is really just us getting used to doing something that's outside of our comfort zone currently. We need to be able to use our voice to say what it is that we need, or whether something is not appropriate for us in that moment, or to advocate for our horses, right? So this is us sitting in the fight channel. Typically, we have some pretty negative associations with the word fight, but what I'm talking about is when I say fight channel, I mean the ability to connect to that sense of sympathetic energy that allows us to move towards something and to stand up for ourselves, or to really, like I say, connect to the core of ourselves and ground and center in the midst of something hard. Now, that practice quite often is something that's unfamiliar to us. So when we get stuck in a certain place, when we either become so familiar with the flight channel and the manifestation of that is primarily fear or anxiety, then any movement outside of that also feels really uncertain, because we're just not used to being able to, I used this phrase before, but mobilize our agency in the midst of pressure and stress. So we need to be able to kind of oscillate between the different modes of being. We need to be able to occupy all the different places in our nervous system as and when it's needed, but also not stay stuck there. so that we're existing on this continuum of being able to rest when it's necessary, to activate in the appropriate way when it's necessary, and then again to come back to baseline. We have been trained out of our agency under stress, meaning that think about some kind of experience in your life where you have been out of alignment with yourself. And I know this happens for most of us on a daily basis, and it can be in something as simple as a conversation. So let's say someone has something to say to you that you actually don't like, or you feel kind of not intimidated by, but potentially, let's say you feel intimidated by it, or you just really disagree with it. And on the inside, your whole narrative is saying you're having a conversation with yourself about how that doesn't feel good to you. And you're registering that on a feeling and sensation level as well. So you feel that in your gut, you understand what that means to you, you understand what it is you would actually like to say. And yet you find yourself completely clamping up, perhaps saying something in agreement with them, and then you have your mind going, what are you saying? Like, you don't think that at all. And this is what I mean by being trained out of our own agency. Most of us have got into such a situation of feeling like we need to fit in, or we need to kind of acquiesce, or we need to minimize ourselves in response to the world, that we've lost that ability to handle that amount of activation in the system that registers some kind of discord. So maybe we disagree with someone, like in the example I just used, but maybe also, there's a situation where we actually need to change things up, say a coach that isn't working for us anymore, or a situation that's not working for us anymore. And yet we find ourselves staying stuck in that cycle because we are simply not practiced at holding space for that amount of activation in the body and being able to mobilize in the midst of it. So that's what I'm really talking about when I'm talking about training yourself to be able to move in different levels of responsiveness. It's increasing your capacity so that when you feel under pressure or stress, you still have your own individual agency available to you. Agency can show up in lots of different ways. It can show up in me needing to physically move my body. It can show up in me using my voice, so actually saying what it is that I think or feel. It can show up in a variety of different ways. We're not just talking about moving, there's a lot of different ways that this manifests. But it's a really important point, and I think that the work that I do in Joyride especially, which is centered around increasing your capacity for big emotions and experiences with your horses, is all about increasing that range. It's all about saying, can we exist fluidly on this continuum? So as and when we need to access these skills and access these ways of being, they are not unfamiliar to us. We are able to do so without our body feeling like it needs to revert into a pre-patterned survival response of either flight or shutdown, which is the most typical ones that I come across. That's a progressive process. The metaphor that I use in Joyride is slow-flying bird, in that you want to approach the work that we do together like a slow-flying bird, because as soon as you drop into the level of the nervous system, you start to shake things up a little bit. You start to stir things around, and that creates energy in the body. And so depending on how big your capacity is, or how much capacity or activation you can handle at that point, that will dictate how long you can stay in that experience before you go into a more shutdown mode. So super important that we do this slowly so that we're able to elasticize the edges of our comfort zone without automatically defaulting into a response which sees us abandon ourselves. What I'm talking about when I say abandoning ourselves is that experience has got bigger than our body, bigger than our resources that we can draw on, and bigger than our capacity to intentionally direct that energy. And so we disassociate from the moment. We disassociate from ourselves and from the moment. Back to novelty. So why is novelty so important? When I did that session together last week, what I introduced was a couple of different movement-based practices that were a little bit left field, right? Really basic, nothing extreme in terms of how it is we were physically moving our body or what it is I asked of anyone. For the most part, you could still stay sitting while we did those activities. However, they weren't the norm. And the reason that I introduced those particular movement-based practices into that workshop where we were looking to uncouple activation or energy in the body from a negative label was simply because they were unlikely to be familiar to everyone that was participating in that session with me. Now, when we engage in something unfamiliar, that's really good grounds for the itty bitty shitty committee to pop up and say, hey, what's going on here? You might look a little bit silly doing that. Or is this something you really want to do? Or are you sure she knows what she's talking about? So it's great grounds for recognizing how it is you respond when something unfamiliar to your nervous system, unfamiliar to the way that you usually go about things, comes into your reality. And what I'm always trying to get across is the work that we're doing together. So the work that I do, the nervous system awareness work, the movement-based work, the work on really increasing our capacity and developing our emotional intelligence to the point where we're able to really ground and center in the midst of discomfort, is all about meeting novelty and having a level of responsiveness in your system that means you don't go to a place that's unhelpful for you. So those really basic little activities are so useful to start to understand how it is your patterning is affecting how it is you're showing up in the world, and then consequently for your horses. So we have this ability to do so much away from the arena, away from the saddle, away from our horses, that indicates where it is we're sitting nervous system wise, that tells us how close our relationship with the itty bitty shitty committee and what it is we have available to us to be able to meet that with compassion. And then we can develop these skills in a non-pressurized environment, so then we can take them back to the arena and meet them with a different sense of reverence and skill. So when we think about novelty, what we're talking about is something unfamiliar to you. Something that isn't part of the norm, something that takes you outside of the day-to-day. I'm not talking about a jack-in-a-box or like the clown popping out from around the corner, although that could be a potential option to work with. But if you think about it, especially as we move into our adult lives, everything we do is relatively predictable and linear. So if I think about the way that my week used to pan out, because I am a seeker of novelty these days, but if I think about the way that my week used to pan out, I understood that everything was pretty same. So many of us will go to the gym, and when we go to the gym, we don't do something left field. We don't do a class that's completely unfamiliar to us for the most part. We do the same thing. We have our Monday class, or we have our Wednesday class, or we have our Friday class, or we have an exercise routine that we do at home, that we go for a walk or we go for a run or we do this class online or whatever it is. The reason that I'm talking about this is just to highlight or to hopefully get you to think about how much unusual, quote unquote, activity you have in your day. And I would hazard a guess to say it's not really that much. We, for the most part, have a pretty predictable sense of what our week will look like within what is within our control, right? So you do the same things, your hobbies are fairly static, you engage in the same kind of lessons, you work with the same kind of people, you do the same kind of things through your day. If we think about that then, and we think about how it is ultimately we're wanting to train our responsiveness, and how it is ultimately we're wanting to start to create some new ways of going about things, you can then understand that it might be necessary to actually seek out things that aren't so familiar so that you can train yourself to be able to hold space for that experience without leaving the building, literally and metaphorically. And that could be even just entertaining the possibility of doing something different. If you think about children then and how it is they move through the world, There's novelty built into their day all over the place. It's part of the learning experience. We recognize, we might call it stimulation. Sometimes it's actually too much, so we're kind of overdoing it for them. But they're constantly being met with things that are unfamiliar to them and being required to adapt and assimilate and learn new things and develop a degree of responsiveness to that in the midst of that experience. Now, as we get older, that fuses out. We no longer seek out novelty, and no one is responsible for us, meaning that they're not looking at me and going, wow, Jane, I think Jane could use a little bit more stimulation, or I think she's got a little bit rote in how she's approaching things. So let's mix things up in her day. I am in control of my own time. As adults and as humans generally, we crave certainty. We like a little bit of uncertainty, just enough to keep things interesting. But for the most part, we really crave predictability and certainty. And what that does is see us live in certain places on a sensation and feeling level and on a nervous system level, so that we lose that adaptability. We lose that fluidity simply because our usual way of going about things is not being challenged that often. We're not actually required to step out of the space that we're in and think about how it is we would respond differently. So that's why things like traveling, those sorts of experiences where you're really like thrown outside of your normal way of going about things, expands you so much because you're required to assimilate all of this new information. You feel like a new person because literally the information coming into your nervous system is new. You are required to respond in different ways. You are new in so many senses because you're awakening the parts of yourself that essentially had been dormant, or you hadn't been required to access simply because the way that you are going about things on a day-to-day didn't actually invite that or require it. Then we think about the way that it is we're working with our horses and what that brings up. And there's so much within that is out of our direct control. So my hope is that everyone who is listening to me right now is really interested not only in their own development and behavior and kind of how it is we can go about integrating and getting to really, good feeling spaces essentially, but we have the same aspirations for our horses. So when we're working together with them, we're really concerned about how it is they can emotionally self-manage and have the tools to do so, how it is we get them to a good feeling space, how it is we can essentially develop that partnership so the relationship between us is transformational and not just transactional. And within that experience, especially if you're working with a young horse, for example, or a horse that's unfamiliar to you, there's a lot of novelty that comes up because you're not in control of what they bring to the party all the time. And so you're required to go to these different places in your nervous system. And then the question is asked, if you're here, do you lose your center? Over here, if you're required to go over here for the sake of your horse, does that feel too much? Does that send you into freeze? All hypothetical stories, but hopefully you get what it is that I'm talking about. So my question to you, or my challenge, if you like, over the next little week until we talk again, is just to think about that, to think about how much novelty exists in your day and how it is you could go about inviting some of that into your experience. Not just to keep things fresh, but as part of enlivening your system, as part of being able to develop a responsiveness to your environment where you're able to move accordingly, where you feel like you don't go into this default response, which is unhelpful to you and to the situation at hand. And where ultimately you are creating a level of responsiveness in your nervous system where no matter what it is that arises, you can stay grounded and centered in the midst of that. And often we don't give ourselves long enough, we aren't able to hold space long enough for an experience to allow it to transform. And so that's where if we have situations where something feels uncomfortable or even feels unacceptable to us, which is a whole nother conversation in and of itself, we push it away because we feel like if we invite it in, it will give it some sort of permanency. But the irony is, if we were to actually invite it in and to sit with it, it would naturally transform and alchemize. It's the pushing away It's the not allowing that actually creates the solidity, because then we see this fixed thing on the horizon or out the corner of our eye that we're trying to avoid. And that creates the binary, that creates the polarity that has the essence of challenge in it. So think about that. Have a look at your week, like if you were to project yourself forward, and think about what is the likelihood of you doing something different within that. Do you ever do something that different? And some of you will. Like some of you will have really mixed up experiences as the nature of your work, or perhaps you're an artist and so on and so forth. But even within that, even within workspaces or creative pursuits which are a little bit more dynamic than others, there's a certain predictability that arises in that as well. So this is very individually dependent. I'm interested in you breaking this down because I think it's such an important thing to understand and to bring into our lives as adults. How much novelty is there? How much wonderment do we allow into our day? And do we stand still long enough to notice it? That's it from me, team. You have a fabulous rest of your day, and I'm super excited to talk with you in the next episode.